The stocks were simple. They were a tool of public shame. Imagine two wooden planks, one on top of the other. The planks had hinges on one side and a lock on the other. In the middle, where the planks met, were two carved half circles. When you closed the planks, these half circles formed two holes. These holes were for a person's ankles. That was the most common type of stocks. Your feet would be on one side of the boards and your body on the other. You'd be forced to sit on the ground or on a low bench with your legs stretched out in front of you, locked in place. Sometimes there were more holes. A larger set of stocks might have spaces for 2 or 3 people at once. These were for punishing a group that had committed a crime together, like a brawl after too much ale. Some versions of the device also had holes for the wrists. This was less common for stocks and blurred the line with another device, the pillory. The pillory was a more severe punishment. It held your head in hands, forcing you to stand. You were much more exposed in a pillory. The stocks were generally for lesser crimes. They were uncomfortable and humiliating, but they were a step down from the pillory. You were sitting, at least. You could slump, you had a bit more dignity, though not much. The wood used was whatever was cheap and strong. Oak was good. It was heavy and hard to break. The construction was not fancy. The village carpenter would make it. It was functional, brutal, and built to last. The iron lock was the only complex part. It had to be strong enough to keep the person from being freed by their friends. The key was held by the local constable or reeve, the person in charge of law and order in the village or town. Where you found the stocks was just as important as what they were. They were never hidden away. Their entire purpose was to be seen. You would find them in the most public part of town. The market square was a perfect spot. Everyone came to the market to buy and sell, to gossip, to see and be seen. Placing the stocks right in the middle of this activity guaranteed the largest possible audience. Another common place was outside the main church. After Sunday service, the entire parish would walk past and see who had been misbehaving that week. Near the town gates was another good location. Anyone entering or leaving the town would have to pass by the person being punished. This placement was the whole point. The punishment wasn't just the physical discomfort of being locked in place. The real punishment was the shame. It was a form of social correction. Your neighbors, your friends, your family, even strangers would see you. They would know what you had done. In a small medieval community, your reputation was everything. It affected who you could marry, who would do business with you, and how you were treated day to day. Having everyone see you locked in the stocks was a deep and lasting stain on that reputation. The stocks were a symbol of local justice. They showed that the town or manor had rules, and that those rules were enforced. They were a constant visible warning to everyone else. Walk past the stocks on your way to buy bread, and you'd be reminded of what happens to people who cheat their customers or get drunk and start fights. It was a simple, effective, and very cheap way to maintain order. There was no need for a large, expensive jail. For most minor crimes, a few hours in the stocks was considered enough. The memory of the shame and the laughter of the crowd would stick with you a lot longer than the ache in your legs. It was a raw and direct form of justice, played out in the open for all to see. The community wasn't just watching the punishment, they were a part of it. Their judgment, their pointing fingers, and their scorn was the true penalty. You didn't end up in the stocks for murder or treason. Those were capital crimes, and they had punishments to match. The stocks were for the small stuff, the everyday annoyances and minor rule-breaking that disrupted the peace of a town. They were a tool for dealing with social problems, not serious felonies. The list of crimes that could land you in the stocks tells you a lot about what medieval society cared about. It was all about public order and honesty. One of the most common reasons was public drunkenness. If you had too much ale at the tavern and started singing loudly, stumbling into people, or starting a fight, you could expect to wake up the next morning with your ankles locked in wood. It was a way for the town to sober you up and make an example of you. The headache from the ale would be matched by the jeers of the crowd. It was a very effective way to discourage disruptive drinking. Petty theft was another sure way to find yourself in the stocks. Stealing a loaf of bread, a chicken from a neighbor's yard, or a few vegetables from the market. These weren't major heists. They were crimes of poverty or opportunity, but they still upset the social fabric. People needed to trust that their property was safe. Putting a thief in the stocks served two purposes. It punished them with shame, and it publicly marked them as untrustworthy. Everyone in town would now know to keep a closer eye on their belongings when that person was around. Cheating in business was taken very seriously. The medieval market depended on a basic level of trust. A baker who sold loaves of bread that were underweight was cheating everyone. An alewife who watered down her beer was doing the same. These people would be put in the stocks. often with the evidence of their crime displayed with them. The dishonest baker might have the light loaf of bread hung around his neck. The cheating brewer might be forced to drink his own terrible ale until he was sick. It was a very direct form of justice. The punishment fit the crime, and it sent a clear message to other merchants: deal honestly, or you'll be next. Speaking out of turn could also get you in trouble. Blasphemy, which meant saying disrespectful things about God or the church, was a serious offense. While major heresy could get you burned at the stake, a minor, thoughtless curse might earn you a few hours in the stocks to think about your words. Slander was another one. Spreading lies about your neighbors could ruin their reputation. If you were caught doing it, you'd be the one publicly shamed, your own reputation suffering in the most visible way possible. There were also crimes that we might not even consider crimes today. Being a common scold was a punishable offense, usually for women. A scold was a person who argued, gossiped, and disturbed the peace with her words. A woman who was constantly fighting with her neighbors could be sentenced to the stocks. It was a way of enforcing social harmony and gender roles. Women were expected to be quiet and agreeable. The stocks were a tool to punish those who weren't. Vagrancy, or being a homeless wanderer, could also land you in the stocks. In the medieval world, everyone was expected to have a place. You were part of a village, a parish, a manor. You had a lord, a job, a family. Strangers with no clear purpose were viewed with suspicion. They might be thieves, beggars, or just people avoiding their responsibilities. Putting a vagrant in the stocks for a few hours was a way of encouraging them to move on, to go somewhere else. The decision to put someone in the stocks was usually made locally. It wasn't a king's court that handled these things. It was a manor court, presided over by the lord of the manor or his steward, or it was a town magistrate. The justice was swift. There were no long, drawn-out trials for stealing a pie. The evidence was heard, a judgment was made, and the sentence was often carried out immediately. The constable would walk you from the court to the market square and lock you in. It was a simple system for simple problems, designed to keep the peace in a small, tight-knit world where everyone knew everyone else's business. Being put in the stocks was a miserable experience. It began with the humiliation of being marched through the town by the constable. People would stop and stare. Children might follow behind, pointing and shouting. You knew where you were going. You knew what was about to happen. There was no escape from the shame. When you reached the stocks, the constable would produce a large iron key. He'd unlock the device, and the top plank would be lifted up. You were forced to sit down, often on a cold, damp ground or a low, hard bench. Then you had to lift your legs and place your ankles into the two lower half circles. The feeling of the rough, splintery wood against your skin was the first hint of the discomfort to come. Then came the worst part. The top plank was slammed down. The sound of the heavy wood closing was final. Your ankles were now trapped. The constable would then fit the padlock and turn the key. The click of the lock was a sound of absolute powerlessness. You were stuck. For the first few minutes, it might not seem so bad. But the human body is not meant to be held in one position for long. The stocks forced you into an unnatural posture. You couldn't shift your weight properly. You couldn't stand up or bend your knees. Soon your muscles would begin to cramp. Your lower back would start to ache. Pins and needles would creep into your feet. The ache would grow from a dull throb to a persistent grinding pain. There was no relief. Then there was the weather. You were completely exposed to the elements. On a hot summer day, the sun would beat down on you. You'd be sweating, thirsty, with no way to get a drink or wipe your own brow. Flies would buzz around your face, and you couldn't shoo them away. On a cold day, the damp from the ground would seep into your bones. The wind would cut through your clothes. The rain would soak you to the skin, and you would just have to sit there, shivering and miserable. There was no shelter. Your vulnerability was absolute. You couldn't defend yourself. If a dog came up and sniffed at you, you couldn't kick it away. If rats scurried over your feet at night, you couldn't move. This helplessness was a huge part of the psychological punishment. You were reduced to a state less than human, an object on display. But the physical discomfort was often secondary to the social torment. The whole point of the stocks was the crowd. And the crowd was rarely kind. People would walk by and stare. They would point. They would laugh. Your friends and neighbors, people you saw every day, would mock you. They would call out the details of your crime. There's Tom, the baker who sells air instead of bread. Look at Mary, she drank all her husband's wages. The insults were personal and sharp. It often got worse than just words. The stocks were a tempting target. People would throw things. It started with harmless stuff, maybe some grass or leaves. But it could quickly escalate. People would throw rotten vegetables from the market. A soft, mushy tomato would splatter against your face, its juice and seeds running down your cheek. A rotten cabbage would hit the wood next to your head with a loud thud. The smell was awful. Worse still was the animal dung. People would scrape it from the street and fling it at you. It was the ultimate act of contempt. You would be covered in filth, unable to clean yourself. You just had to sit there and endure it. Sometimes people would throw stones. This was dangerous. A well-aimed rock could cause a serious injury. The mood of the crowd determined your fate. A light-hearted crowd might just tease you. An angry crowd could turn the stocks into a truly brutal ordeal. The hours would crawl by. Each minute felt like an hour. You would watch the sun move across the sky, counting down the time until your release. There was nothing to do but sit there and take the abuse, feeling the pain in your body and the deep, burning shame in your soul. When the constable finally came to unlock you, you would be stiff, sore, and filthy. You could barely stand, your legs weak and numb. You would stumble home, trying to avoid the eyes of the people who had just spent the day mocking you. The physical pain would fade in a day or two. The memory of the humiliation would last a lifetime. The stocks were not a private affair between the criminal and the law. They were a piece of public theater, and the community was the audience, the chorus, and sometimes the co-stars. The reaction of the crowd was what gave the punishment its real power. Without the pointing fingers and the shouted insults, being locked in a wooden frame would just be a boring, uncomfortable afternoon. With the crowd, it became an unforgettable lesson in social conformity. For many people, the stocks were a form of entertainment. Life in a medieval village could be monotonous. The rhythm of the seasons and the hard work of farming or crafting dominated daily life. There were few distractions. A person in the stocks was a spectacle. It was a break in the routine. People would gather around, not necessarily out of anger, but out of curiosity and a desire for some drama. It was a live show happening right in the center of town. They would watch the person squirm, listen to the taunts, and maybe even join in. It was a grim sort of fun, a way to pass the time, but it was more than just entertainment. It was a way for the community to reinforce its own values. When people gathered to mock a baker who cheated his customers, they were all, in that moment, agreeing on something: honesty in business is important to us. When they jeered at a public drunk, they were collectively saying we value sobriety and public order. The person in the stocks became a living symbol of what not to do. By participating in the shaming, each member of the community reaffirmed their commitment to the group's rules. It strengthened social bonds by creating a clear, us the law-abiding community and a them, the person who broke the rules. The act of throwing things was also deeply symbolic. It wasn't just random cruelty. Throwing rotten food was a way of showing that the person was no better than garbage. They had, through their actions, made themselves an outcast, someone to be discarded. Throwing mud and animal dung was an act of profound contempt. It was a way of physically marking the person as dirty and impure. It was a visceral, non-verbal way for the community to express its disgust. Each piece of filth that was thrown was a small vote of condemnation from a member of the public. The crowd's reaction wasn't always the same, however. It could be influenced by who the person was and what they had done. If the person in the stocks was a well-known bully or a widely disliked cheat, the crowd's response might be genuinely vicious. People might use the opportunity to settle old scores, and the taunts could be especially cruel. The punishment would be severe because the community's anger was real. On the other hand, if the person was generally well-liked and had committed a minor, understandable crime, the reaction might be different. Perhaps a young man who got into a fight over a girl, or a poor woman who stole some food to feed her children. In these cases, the crowd might be more subdued. There might be some quiet muttering, some head shaking, but not the same level of glee and cruelty. Some people might even feel a bit of pity. They understood that the law had to be followed, but their hearts weren't in the punishment. In these situations, the person in the stocks would still suffer shame, but they wouldn't be terrorized. This meant the community had a strange kind of power. The official sentence might be 4 hours in the stocks, but the crowd decided what those 4 hours would actually be like. They were the ones who could turn it from a quiet, sullen penance into a terrifying and painful ordeal. The constable locked the ankles, but the community delivered the real punishment. This public participation in justice was central to the medieval worldview. Justice wasn't something that happened behind closed doors in a courtroom. It was performed in the open, with the involvement of the people. It was a lesson for everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest elder. The stocks were a classroom, and the subject was the price of breaking the rules. The groans of the person being punished and the roars of the crowd were the sounds of the social order correcting itself. The stocks were a common sight for centuries, but they eventually disappeared. Their decline wasn't sudden. It was a slow process driven by deep changes in how people thought about crime, punishment, and human dignity. The world that had created the stocks was fading, and a new one was taking its place. One of the biggest factors was the rise of new ideas during the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries. Thinkers began to question traditional forms of authority and punishment. They argued that justice should be rational, not just traditional. They started to think about the purpose of punishment. Was it just to inflict pain and shame? Or should it be about reforming the criminal? The idea of rehabilitation began to take root. Public shaming, which was designed to scar a person's reputation forever, seemed cruel and unproductive. It didn't make the person better, it just made them an outcast. Alongside these new ideas came the rise of the modern prison. Before this, jails were mostly just holding places for people awaiting trial or execution. They weren't seen as a punishment in themselves, but as populations grew and societies became more complex, the idea of locking people away as a formal sentence became more common. A prison sentence was seen as a more orderly and controlled form of punishment than the chaotic spectacle of the stocks. It removed the offender from society, which satisfied the need for public safety. It was a punishment that could be precisely measured in months or years, unlike the unpredictable ordeal of the stocks, which depended on the mood of the crowd. Justice was moving from the public square to the walled institution. Punishment was becoming a private matter, handled by the state, not a public performance. There was also a growing sense of public decency. As towns grew into cities and society became more anonymous, the idea of a half-naked, filth-covered person on display in the middle of the street began to seem barbaric. What was once seen as normal justice now looked like a chaotic and undignified mess. The upper and middle classes, in particular, began to find such public displays distasteful. They wanted their streets to be orderly and clean, not stages for public humiliation. The stocks started to seem like a relic of a cruder, less civilized time, so the stocks were gradually phased out. By the 19th century, they were a rarity in most of Europe, used only in very remote or traditional villages. They held on for a surprisingly long time in some parts of England and America, but their days were numbered. They were replaced by fines, short jail sentences, and the workhouse. The wooden beams were left to rot in the town square, or were broken up for firewood. A whole system of justice, based on public shame, had come to an end. But did the idea behind the stocks really die? The wooden device is gone, but the human impulse to publicly shame rule breakers is still very much alive. We just use different tools now. The market square has been replaced by the internet. Social media has become a kind of digital stocks. When someone says or does something that the online community disapproves of, they can be subjected to a massive wave of public condemnation. Thousands of strangers can descend on their profile, flooding them with insults, mockery, and threats. Their personal information might be shared. Their employer might be contacted. They are held up for public scorn, just like the person locked by their ankles in the village square. The goal is the same: to punish the person through overwhelming social pressure and to make an example of them for everyone else. The principles are eerily similar. The punishment is public. The community participates directly. The level of cruelty can depend on the unpredictable mood of the crowd, and the shame can have a lasting impact on a person's life and reputation. The technology has changed, but the fundamental human dynamic of using public humiliation as a tool for social control remains. The stocks may be gone from our town squares, but the ghosts of that punishment still linger in the way we live now. It serves as a reminder that while our methods of justice may seem more civilized, the line between justice and cruelty can still be a very thin one.